Hello and welcome to the Sandip Roy Show on Express Audio.
The Sandip Roy Show.
The Mangalyaan mission didn't just launch a Mars orbiter into space. It launched the image of the women of ISRO into our cultural space. That even spurred a film, Mission Mangal, starring Vidya Balan and Akshay Kumar. The Chandrayaan landing saw a resurgence of more women of ISRO pictures all over social media. It was hailed as a good moment for Indian science and a good moment for the women in Indian science. But just recently, the most prestigious science awards were announced in India after a gap of a year. The Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Awards. 12 winners, not a single woman. We could say, look at the science, not the gender. But whichever way you look at it, something's not adding up. So we turned to Nandita, Jayaraj and Aashima Dogra to help solve this mystery. They are the authors of the new book, Lab Hopping, Women Scientists in India, and the duo behind the popular website, The Life of Science. Aashima Dogra and Nandita Jayaraj, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Sandip.
Thanks for having us. Nice to be here.
Originally, I wanted to begin by asking your reaction to, those famous ISRO photographs of rejoicing women scientists, both from Mangalyaan in 2014, I think, and then Chandrayaan right now in 2023, because that period is the period that covers many of the interviews in your book. But now we just heard that after a year's gap, the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar prizes have been announced and all 12 recipients are men. So somehow this doesn't compute. I mean, are these both outlier events or is there a dotted line connecting them?
This is Nandita. The Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Awards that were released very, very recently with respect to our conversation for sure is not an outlier, because the last time it was announced in 2021 also there were 0 women who won it. And in fact, there have been about a little more than 580 scientists who have been recognized by the Bhatnagar Awards in the past 50 plus years. And there have only been 19 of these that have been women scientists. It's a completely normal thing in the world of the Bhatnagar Awards. And the famous ISRO photograph from the Mangalyaan mission was, I think, quite a few years back. But I think that is a lot more reflective of reality, that there are plenty of women contributing to Indian science, not many of them in the most visible positions. Even in ISRO, there are very few women who are heading projects, and we literally know every single one of them. And in fact, even the famous photograph, it later came to be known that a lot of the women in the sari photograph were not scientists, were not engineers, but they might have been occupying various administrative positions and contributing in other ways. What you're saying is completely true. It just does not make sense, because on one hand, they want to tell us that it's a wonderful world and women are included and they're contributing greatly. But on the other hand, we just don't see the recognition.
So I'd like to add, this is Aashima's voice. So actually, Sandip, you're quoted in the book.
Yeah, I found that.
Yes. Because I think what you wrote about the Mangalyaan sari photo was very clearly telling of how we were all feeling about this photo. That photo is, in a way, struck out in the Indian imagination and also the imagination of the world when they think about India. And this is what we also wanted to capture in the book, and we've written about it in the Woman on Top chapter. Because for us, it was like a woman on top moment in the story of Indian science. And like you wrote, it was surprising and kind of shocking to see this kind of persons in such a techie environment, like the gajra and the bright sari, the silk sari, the bindi, etc. This hugging gesture, very happy, very, friendly. You don't see that firstly in tech spaces. It doesn't really fit right. Another thing I would like to say is, because I talked about this bindi and the sari and the gajra, now in Chandrayaan we again saw the resurgence of this trope, like this oddity was discussed again, WhatsApp forwards were sent. Even more, look, these are the women of ISRO. And this picture, like Agna Ronath also posted this picture and talked about traditional Indian women doing great things. So this also is telling, if you think about it a little bit more than a minute, you can see that what we're really saying. We're talking again about the appearance of apparently women scientists. This is the scope of public dialogue when we talk about women scientists. And that's quite unfortunate. And with the book and with our project, we did kind of try to do the opposite, to kind of normalize what Indian women scientists is, because there are so many of them.
And in fact, you've written that both of you in an early avatar, when you were working on a science magazine, had to sort of push against this stereotype that the mad scientist or is this man with unkempt hair sitting in a lab, which is the image that we all have when we think of the scientist in the lab.
This is Nandita. It was particularly disturbing for Aashima and me because we were working at this children's magazine, and it was a small magazine. We had just maybe a couple of thousand subscribers, if I'm not mistaken, and there were a fair number of very young, science enthusiasts who used to write us emails and who we knew were being influenced and were getting their first impressions of science through this magazine. So the moment when we started realizing how skewed the representation of scientists was in the magazine that we were producing, it disturbed us a lot. Of course, there is the aspect of, history of science is dominated by white old men, so we can't change history. But what we could do was make an effort to comb through the archives, to ask people, for scientists who may not have been recognized as much but may have contributed to that field, and moreover work with artists who had the liberty to expand our imagination of what the scientist would look like. My favorite example is, I think this was a story that either Aashima wrote or Aashima edited, but the writer of the story just mentioned that there is this one scientist who lived in this secluded place, and the artist reimagined the scientist to be an old woman on a wheelchair. It even challenged my limits of what I had imagined while reading the story, and it was so brilliant to see this brown old woman depicted as this genius scientist, something that usually only one kind of person gets that privilege.
And did you get pushback from higher ups in the magazine?
No, that did not happen, happily. I think we're all ready for this vision of a scientist to be challenged. I think it was well received, but unfortunately, I think it doesn't happen too often. And when we're talking about science, it's just easier to kind of clock back to this genius scientist, old man with big hair, shaking test tubes.
Right.
And if I could just quickly add, it was sometimes well received and sometimes it was not received at all, which in a way is the point, because we didn't want to do this for it to be noticed and for people to say, oh, wow, they're so woke, they had a woman scientist. But we wanted to do it in a way where people just consume that content without realizing what they were consuming, and hopefully it sort of settles in their psyche and gradually gets normalized in time.
Well, maybe the people behind the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Prize have not consumed the ISRO photograph in the way we were just talking about for it to be settled in the psyche. But jokes aside, people will say that, for example, right now, the director of the CSIR, which guides the selection process, is a woman, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm sure you will hear this argument all the time that we should focus on the science and not the gender of the scientist, because now you can't have the argument anymore that you might have had 30 years ago, is that there are just not enough women scientists out there. The process of change is just beginning. It's been a while now.
Okay, I can respond to this. Yeah, with respect to the Bhatnagar Awards, and in fact, it's not only the Bhatnagar Awards, there is also another government award called the Swarna Jayanti Fellowship, which is equally prestigious, but for slightly younger scientists. The Bhatnagar is for under 45 and Swarna Jayanti is maybe under 40. So even that tells you, right? You could argue that there aren't enough women scientists and it's just a natural outcome of this less women scientists in the pool. But there is no less women scientists in an under 45 age pool, and it's definitely not less enough to explain 0 out of 23 in the past 2 awards. There's a very animated discussion happening here between scientists and journalists right now post the Bhatnagar Award announcements. And like you said, there is this great defensive attitude from scientists saying, we're focusing on the wrong thing. And we're just trying to be woke, and that's not what we should be concentrating on, but we should be looking at the science that these people are doing. And people like us who make these critiques are having to constantly disclaim that no offense to the winners, we're sure that they are worthy. It just goes to say there's so much of fear, there's so much of insecurity for some reason among our scientists, which I think is why they're hesitant to engage with this issue. But in this WhatsApp group with all these animated discussions, Rahul Siddharthan, who is a theoretical scientist from Chennai, just did some math, and because he's a mathematician, I will take his word for it, that the chances of picking 0 out of 23 scientists are negligible. It's virtually impossible for this to happen. It's something that's seriously wrong and needs to be looked into.
Is something seriously wrong with the way the nominations happen then?
I think so. I can't really say exactly what's wrong, but the thing is, the whole process is extremely, extremely opaque. There is no transparency about how our science awardees are being selected. And it has been the case since the beginning. The argument is the standard argument that if you know the process and if you know the people involved, then there are chances that, hopefuls will try to appease and you might get a corrupt system. I mean, it's a good argument, but I think the process itself can be transparent. And like you said, the director of CSIR, who is the governing body of the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar, is now a woman. In the recent years, there are many new women directors in the science world in our institutions. But I'm afraid what I fear is if these initiatives are tokenistic, this would be a great concern, because when it really comes down to recognition, be it the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Prize or the Swarna Jayanti Fellowship and other fellowships, not just government ones, even the Infosys Science Prize is a much celebrated prize. The numbers there are not much better. So I think what we need is for more transparency, for these publicly owned recognition to be open to the public, for us to know what's going on, or at least for these committees, this nomination process, this application process to be at least revealed to the journalists who are interested in covering it. We have tried, but just the response that we've gotten is that it's a secret. There is one scientist who I will not name. She's a physicist, and she was once delivering a physics lecture at a CSIR institute and was talking about this sorry state of affairs that there is. I mean, now we have one physics Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar awardee since a few years ago, but during the time of this lecture, there had been never one. So she was delivering a lecture talking about that no woman physicist has been given the SSB prize at a CSIR institute, and a CSIR employee stood up and said, but you cannot talk about this. This is a secret process, and that he himself did not know that women have been not awarded.
But here again, and this to both of you, Aashima and Nandita, is that when it's such a skewed state of affairs, where it's 0 out of 23 or whatever, then see the next time there is 1 or 2, then immediately the flip argument comes up, that which you were saying is that, oh, this is like the tokenistic awards. So I imagine this whole project must have been a bit of a double-edged sword for both of you, because women scientists want to be known for their science and not for their womanhood. What kind of reactions were you getting?
That was exactly the case, Sandip. It was kind of a tricky road that we had to travel on as journalists, because Our motive, at least when we started the project, was very much just to figure out what was the science being done in India. We did not really make a great effort to get into the gender bias aspect of it still. I mean, until we realized that there were so many people saying similar kinds of things. And that's when we really started looking more into their gendered experiences and asking them slightly more targeted questions. And like you said, it wasn't always easy, and we were very understanding of this sometimes because we had to make sure that, I mean, a lot of these scientists just want to do their job. They don't want to be known as a woman scientist. The recently announced IIT director also has this huge load on her shoulders now because she's the first ever woman to be appointed as director of an IIT. But I think we've seen, I mean, most women scientists that we've spoken to understand that we can't afford to be completely non-cognizant of this gap. So I think there are more people who are willing to speak about their gender experiences than the people who weren't. The scale of the non-representation and the problem, I think, is just so absurdly high that, I mean, you won't really find anyone who says that this is not an issue.
Yeah, that's true, because I remember, on this show, we once had the climate scientist Sulochana Gadgil on talking about, and she went to the US in the 60s, I guess, and all of that. And she always sort of made a point of saying that she personally, coming from the background she did in Pune, very supportive family, and she was welcomed back with her expertise, that she didn't face an issue as to being a lonely woman scientist in a meteorological world that was mainly all men. But she did concede that it may have been different in other parts. She just considered herself somewhat that she was lucky or exempt from it, which also goes back to another meteorologist that you quote in the book. And I wanted one of you to tell her story, which is Anna Mani, who is a very famous scientist and who also said, what is this hoopla over women in science? I'm not bothered about gender, only about quality work.
So I think Nandita is more suited to talking about Anna Mani. She wrote a brilliant book called Anna's Extraordinary Experiments with Weather. It's a children's book and it's really, really endearing and inspiring. Anna Mani actually was now a deceased scientist, but she was a physicist in Bangalore, and she was one of the first women students of the acclaimed Indian scientist C.V. Raman. And she worked in Raman's lab, and there is a brilliant book by Abha Sur which talks about three of C.V. Raman's women scientists, the experiences that they had. So from that book, I know that Anna witnessed a lot of sexism that took place in C.V. Raman's lab. The noteworthy thing about Anna's brilliant scientific career in India is that she never got a PhD for her work. She was not awarded one because she didn't have an official master's degree. And I was at RRI, which is the Raman Research Institute in Bangalore, and I was delivering a talk there, and I took a chance to take a look at her thesis, which should have been rewarded with a PhD. And I took a look at it, and it was quite a bittersweet moment to hold that thing in my hands and know and hear about Anna Mani from the scientists working there. I hear that she was a big presence that walked through labs and took no prisoners. But she, like we write in the book, when Abha, in fact, questioned her, Abha had the fortune of interviewing her before she passed away. And she told Abha that what is this hoopla over women scientists? So she is in the club of women scientists that don't want this woman tag attached to the scientists. I think that's a fair thing because they're scientists. They are not gender studies people, right?
But let me stop you there, Aashima, and ask, fair enough. And yet, Anna Mani almost never gets to be a scientist because of her gender. I mean, C.V. Raman, the Nobel laureate, did not want a woman student.
Yeah, I mean, he did not want, I think, but he had to. Like, there are those like Amla Soni who did sit in at IISc, and he was forced to take women students. So he was a man of his time or whatever. There's also like more details about how sexist he was that one can read about. But like, I don't think Anna would say that she never got to be a scientist. Anna was an accomplished scientist. Even though she doesn't have this formal degree, she did a lot of research work and she did very important work for meteorology in India. But I think Anna also, you have to see, came from a privileged section of society. One that, like, her family supported, as Nandita has written, supported her pursuit of science. So that is to say, all realities of women in India are not the same. And at this point, I want to say, like, then when Abha spoke to Anna Mani, she said such a thing. And even we heard many times, many women say, I'm not a woman scientist, I am a scientist. Right? And I think it's not for them to rally and to have this activism. They are doing their work in this space full of bias. I think the onus is on us, the rest of us who are discussing science. And I think the dialogue has to be kind of heightened up. And only then will the women scientists in the country feel comfortable enough to bring up these issues in their institute. And they don't do it for very good reason. It's because their jobs are on the line. Their opportunities that they might get are on the line. Because there is a thriving old boys club in Indian science, it is not a safe space to, bring attention to yourself as a crusader for women scientists. Championing women in science issues is afforded by only a few women scientists who have reached some level where they can do it. If you are at the bottom, there's a lot to lose. And the system is quite brutal. There is a chapter in our book called Hush Hush, where there's the F word, the feminist word that is kind of looked down upon in Indian science. And women scientists we have interviewed have openly told us that once you declare yourself as a feminist, you get slack for it. You get isolated. So why would a smart person do that,
So, Nandita, in that sense, would you say somebody like Anna Mani is a pioneer and an inspiration, but not necessarily a mentor who opens the doors for other women scientists?
It's difficult to answer that question because you can't control who inspires. And she's one of the few women in science from the past that people constantly bring up when we talk about role models or people who open the road for the rest of us. I cannot make any judgment on Anna's worthiness as a role model, but at the same time, I think we also argue this in the book that it did not seem to have been her primary motive to inspire more girls into science or to make the arena a more hospitable place for younger women in science. But whereas we did meet a lot of obviously contemporary women in science who were making that effort. So if we argued that in some way Anna did not bother about or was not one of the scientists who sort of, opened things up for everyone, it's because we've met people who put themselves at great risk, who have gotten into these uncomfortable situations and put their career on the line, like Aashima said, to make science on the whole accessible to people from, different various marginalized groups, especially caste and transgender scientists, for example, are incredibly brave in what they are doing to improve the situation compared to many other scientists of privilege like Anna Mani. There is somebody called Asha Gopinathan. She's working on a very detailed biography of Anna Mani, and she's, I think, got access to quite a bit of archival material, which I think will, once we read, will really open our eyes a lot more into Anna's lives and her beliefs. So I might be completely mistaken. I'm waiting to read the book.
Yeah, actually, when you talk about encouraging people, young women to come into science, I didn't realize until I was reading Lab Hopping that, in fact, India does not have the same problem as developed countries in the West have in terms of schoolgirls not choosing science. You write that the numbers of Indian women in science up till PhD and postdoc levels are actually quite encouraging.
Yeah, sure. So there is a different pattern of attrition, as it's called, of women in science in India. We don't have the blue and pink issue that the US, for example, has, that girls are not choosing to study science. In fact, up till university level, we see almost a 50-50 according to official government numbers in science. So we also at PhD level, we have quite a lot of gender balance to a good degree. It's after that, as one of our sources has called it, there is a waterfall of women scientists leaving the stream. And this is where many things happen. So after your PhD is when you get a postdoc position or a teaching position. You apply for jobs at institutes, science institutes, research institutes, colleges, universities. And beyond that, of course, is more higher level positions, assistant professor, associate professor, and so on. And also in the private sector, there is private universities, colleges. We see this similar pattern, although there are slight differences. So this waterfall is happening, we think, because women are not being given these positions. There is a hiring bias, there is an opportunity bias. Of course, as we have already discussed, there is a recognition bias. And these are problems specific to India, and there are other problems specific to India is, of course, the big one that is of caste, as I understand it. And the reservation laws of the country are not being properly implemented. There are many, many empty faculty positions that should have been filled but are not filled. So this is how the bias is working in India, that we do have the critical mass, we do have everything that we need to have gender parity, but women and transgender people, in fact, are not being recognized and hired.
And when you have these conversations with the women scientists you interviewed, could you give some examples of how they tackle these questions around caste privilege and transgender? Because, for example, in the US with affirmative action, there's often a critique that the greatest beneficiaries of it have been white women, and that they have not then necessarily wanted to open it up further to other women of color or trans people. Did you encounter that kind of mindset here as well among the women scientists you interviewed, most of whom might have happened to be upper caste?
I think the same thing happens in India as well, which is what we also quickly realized, that the difference in experiences between an upper caste woman in science and an upper caste man in science is not so much. The difference between the experiences of an upper caste woman in science and a marginalized caste woman in science is way vast, more vast, So the caste gap is a lot more severe than the gender gap. I think one big mistake that a lot of our policies, a lot of the dialogues that we have about women in science in India is because we treat all women in science as one sort of homogeneous entity with the same kind of challenges of motherhood and family pressures, and everybody faces the same thing, but that's not true. In fact, when it comes to hiring bias, right, if we're talking about hiring bias or women dropping out, the narrative is always about mothers, about women having to have babies and the biological age coinciding with the tenure clock. That's the kind of language that we use. But when we spoke to researchers who were from, either marginalized castes or transgender researchers, they had a completely different experience. For example, one person we spoke to, Shalini Mahadev. Shalini is a really amazing biologist. I think she's probably completing her PhD, or she's just completed a PhD from University of Hyderabad. But Shalini happens to be over 35. And because she's still relatively early in her scientific career, she doesn't have too many publications to her name. So she talks about how she has to compete. She, as somebody who faced a lot of challenges accessing education, having to delay many milestones in her scientific education, it's practically impossible for her to get now a job in science because of these hiring rules that say you need to be under 35 to join. And her reasons had nothing to do with motherhood and marriage. So a lot of the policies that we have in place for women are not helpful for somebody like her. Similarly, when it comes to childcare, we talk a lot about needing daycare facilities need to be there for all scientists, but especially women scientists. And then when we spoke to Bittu, who is a neuroscientist at Ashoka University, Bittu is a trans man, and Bittu had just adopted a baby when we spoke. So Bittu was telling us when we asked him about childcare that for us, we didn't get much time to to worry about childcare, because adoptive rights itself, for us to have a baby, for us to have the right to adopt a baby itself was unreally difficult. So that hurdle had to be crossed first. And then, of course, we have maternity leave, but we don't have parental leave for adoptive parents uniformly in the country yet. So the variety of experiences that we were fortunate to get, because we did not limit ourselves to top institutes and senior women in science, because of that we were able to understand that there was more to the story that of women and other underrepresented genders in science than we get from most other places that tell us about this.
When you talk about these issues and the sort of lost opportunities because of various bias, hiring bias and all of that, it's very hard to quantify those things in terms of, what is the loss to science, as it were. I was interested that Dr. Gagandeep Kang, whom we've had several times on this show during the COVID pandemic, actually puts a number to it.
So Gagandeep Kang actually is quoted quite heavily in some of the chapters. And I think that's because she has that position, that privilege that we were talking about, where you are at one level and then you can speak, right, without many repercussions. And we're very thankful for her to lend her voice to the movement. And she, like you said, has done the work of calculating, as scientists do, want a number and want to quantify things. And she has said that it would have taken her 4 to 5 years less to reach where she is now if she was a man. And she's, of course, talking about her early years when she had some opportunities to set up a lab. And she talks about simple things like, getting an AC for the lab and being sent for training in PCR, this PCR that we are now too familiar because of COVID. That biotechnology was new when she was in the early stages of her career, and she had a chance to go to the UK to study this and apply it to her work. But of course, as she told us in an interview, she did not get that, and somebody else who just went there for no good reason, came back, did not apply PCR to his work, was chosen. So these kind of insights are valuable, and I think if more women scientists think about it, I think we will get even greater numbers, especially in India because of the delays in funding, etc.
Well, it's interesting that you say, Aashima, that, Gagandeep has reached a kind of superstar status that she's able to say this. But I actually shared this story in my all-male school WhatsApp group, and I was quite surprised at that several people, including somebody who was a doctor, pushed back immediately very hard to say that, that's just a personal opinion. We don't know what she could have really done, 4 to 5 years. That just sounds like someone complaining about the issue. It's entirely subjective. And it was another doctor friend who actually did stand up and say that, honestly, given what she's achieved, I would respect her personal opinion that she lost 4 to 5 years of work more than I might respect yours. But so the pushback is real.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say there is this temptation to not take these statements seriously. Another thing that we constantly heard from scientists was that a woman has to work twice as hard to get to the same stage. Some people would say a woman has to work 4 times as hard. This number kept varying. And then also the statement by Gagandeep. But I am wary of not taking this seriously because I think these are well thought out, calculated statements. There's no way you can say with certainty these kind of things. But when they say it, they have done some calculation in their mind. It's not just thoughtless numbers that they're spewing out. And at least when somebody like Gagandeep Kang says it, I feel like at least a few people would be more willing to give her benefit of doubt. But like you said, there's this hesitance to even trust that someone like Gagandeep Kang knows what she's talking about. So I think Aashima and me have always taken these expressions of imbalance very seriously.
No, as I just said, okay, when someone like a Gagandeep Kang speaks up, carries additional gravitas and weight. But I thought one of the very important points in your book is the fact that we often try and measure this gap or the state of women in science and all of that by these sort of superstar role model scientists, the Gagandeep Kangs out there. Whereas the real issue when we are talking about women's science has to be looking at the middle level, the competent professional scientist who might not be the internationally renowned superstar, but what are the kind of opportunities afforded to her versus a similarly competent non-superstar male scientist?
Most of the myths we know about women in science, that it's not so bad or it's just a function of time and things are getting better. I met a director of an institute who told me that, in India, women actually only need to be half as good as a man, because if an awards committee sees a woman and a man who's competing for this award, they will definitely pick the woman.
Well, we know that person wasn't on the Shanti Swarup Awards committee.
Unless there was never a case where there was a woman and a man ever nominated. But yeah, so we heard these sentiments and we could only explain it by this theory that I think has been proposed called the superstar theory, where we tend to generalize the experiences of a particular demographic based on the experiences of the top people in that space. So in this case, we talked to the Soumya Swaminathans, we talked to the Kiran Mazumdar-Shaws. If we base our understanding of the state of women in science based on these people alone, we will get a completely different and optimistic picture. But if we talk to the middle people, then we realize that how stark the inequality is. And there is this quote by an American feminist, Bella Abzug, which we also write in the book. It's that what we want is a world where a female schlimmel gets as far as a male schlimmel. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
What is a schlimmel?
So my German is not that good, but I think what it means is a nobody.
Yeah, like an ordinary person, basically, and not anyone extraordinary.
Exactly. A mediocre person, which logically should be the bulk of any pool. People who are not, up there and not down there. In that group, the chances of a mediocre male scientist doing well is so much more than a mediocre woman scientist. What we ask from our women scientists seem to be unreally high standards. Nobody would argue that Indian science is mediocre at best. We have plenty of problems. C.N.R. Rao himself has called the state of Indian science mediocre. So why do we have so much mediocrity is something that we need to ask. So we go on about merit so much, but are we really, whatever merit means, are we even, so if we're so meritorious, we should be doing better, at least, if not in terms of, a lot of the metrics of, publications and global impact. We should at least be doing better as a society. We're not letting people do the best as they can.
And when we look at measures to try and rectify this, programs to close the gap, from what you are talking about and what the women you interview talk about, it seems like the government is often focused on issues like getting more girls into science or programs to provide opportunities to mothers who took a break from science because of familial responsibility, or rather that sort of rhetoric that the attrition is because of societal and family responsibilities. But what you're saying is actually not that. So the measures are not really addressing the real problem.
No, they are definitely not. And our policies are misdirected, and they're also, like you said, shifting the blame. Because most of the efforts, I'm saying most, maybe it sounds like there are lots, but the 2 or 3 efforts that we have towards closing the gender gap in science are either directed at inspiring schoolgirls into science. Our schoolgirls do not need inspiration. They're already interested in science. We have enough of them up to the level of PhD. The other effort that our DST, DBT, etc. seem to make is towards bringing women who have had children and took a break, bringing them back into the force. And I think this makes a little bit more sense than the first approach. Also, if you look at how well these programs have worked, we can see that they haven't. they are failing. A lot of the women that use these schemes, benefit from these schemes, are not in the end assimilated into the academic system or do not basically get permanent positions. They get this like bridge programs and then that's it. The performance of these programs by the department's own admission is not great. There is also the Gati program, which is modeled on the Athena Swan program that we see in the UK. But like we have analyzed in the book, there are many differences between the two. How our policy is worded and how the Athena Swan is published already is kind of, I don't want to say defeatist, but very tepid. So I think we need like more push and also for the departments to realize that the problem, the gap, according to official studies done by the government, by the departments themselves, is not that girls are not inspired enough or that they need to be hired. It's bias is the problem, and it's not the women who are at fault. To broaden up, I would say the science culture also has to change in India. And this is part of also how science is done globally. It is based on this very weekends work, long hours, kind of thin yourself out towards science. This is not a very inclusive scheme, right? This is how we think about science. And this needs to change. The culture itself has to become more open, more forgiving, more family-friendly, etc. And then we will see women of all backgrounds and transgendered people and more marginalized people enter our workforce.
Is this a reason why there's this very surprising statistic that 14% of active women scientists in India are single compared to only 2% of men?
Yeah, it might be because science demands a lot. We talk about this in the book that the science culture that we have presently demands you to embody just one identity. Women can't afford that and don't want to embody one identity. They're usually a lot more involved with the community. They are, as we know, very involved in their families. So, yeah, there are, of course, more single women in science than there are single men because it takes a certain kind of person to sacrifice, to make that big sacrifice for science.
And also, I assume that more men have a spouse at home who is taking up that responsibility.
Yeah, like it's the other side of that, right? Like it's saying the same thing.
Which leads to the question, I mean, all these things we've talked about, sexism, sexual harassment, which we actually have not talked a lot about on this, that's such a taboo subject. This is true of every sector. All kinds of fields have to deal with these issues. When you look at science, is there a way in which science is set up which makes these things even more difficult, entrenched, or taboo?
Yeah, I think it's somehow easier for us to imagine, a corporate boss indulging in these unspeakable acts or, sexual harassment or these unscrupulous activities. But in India, we worship scientists, scientists are put on such a pedestal. Science is put on such a pedestal where it is marketed as being completely objective, completely a meritocracy. So any allegation, any illusion of a scientist who is respected, who might be known for his good science being involved in something unsavory is immediately treated with a lot of suspicion, hostility. That is this extra hurdle that science faces. Like you said, all of these things are in some way or the other, sometimes even worse in different professions. But at least there is an acceptance of it. Whereas in science, we're still very far away from this acceptance. Everybody agrees that the number of women in science is too less, but nobody wants to talk about it. We have to stop looking at women in science as an issue of access, as an issue of our social family structures. And we need to start looking at it more of a consequence of discrimination. We need to ask who is doing the discriminating. Is there any of our policies, are there any clauses that are directed at punishing the discriminators? There is this adamant feeling that I think we can just attain gender equality in a very feel-good way. Just highlight the work that women are doing, everybody applauds, and, gender equality is achieved. But that is clearly failing. And it's only when we have a little more extreme radical measures, it's only those kind of measures that have given us some sort of output. For example, with the IITs, it's only when the supernumerary schemes, which is an affirmative active scheme, which IITs do not want to call reservation, but it's only because of that we have almost 20% of undergraduate girls in IITs today. Everything else until then, Inspiring Girls, Vigyan Jyoti, all of the schemes until then failed. And even now, even though we have the supernumerary scheme in the IITs, they still don't want to engage with what is wrong with the JEEs.
What we should explain here is that for some reason in the JEE, if you look at the top 100, very rarely, very few women make it into the top 100. And nobody has really given a good explanation why.
Yes.
So looking at all what you've outlined, are you going to say that despite the ISRO photographs, do you see the gender gap actually getting wider?
So that's the name of our last chapter, that the gap can worsen. And as it looks now, and this is not just me saying it, like there are people who we've spoken to who've done the studies who also express that it can get worse. And as we are seeing now, 2 times in a row, 2021, 2022, SSB did not find one woman or any non-cis man worthy of this great science award. So it is, in a way, getting worse.
And can I stop you there once,
Sure.
Aashima? And it just made me think, do you think in that sense, if it's where it might be getting worse, that a photograph like the ISRO one can prove to be counterproductive because it allows us a feel-good visual, and we are such a visual-oriented culture, it allows us a feel-good visual to deny the gap?
I think in a way it normalizes the gap. It's okay, like we can sleep through the night. We saw some brightly colored saris in an ISRO environment. Everything is fine. We are traditional while being on the moon. What does that even mean? Yeah, I think if you don't think about it long and hard and you don't engage in the dialogue, it actually does more disservice. And we are in this environment of tokenism. But we need to see the numbers. In the end, I will say, like a scientist, we need to see those faculty numbers increasing. We need to see more open culture, more people taking paternity leaves. Like, there are very bad conditions of childcare services, like creches and stuff, in our top-notch institutes. So it doesn't look that great, but the way that I make peace with it, and also in the book, we kind of cling on to that, is that we are behind the women scientists who are asking for a change, who are collecting the data, who are offering the solutions, who are there. And we know that the younger people are not going to take things lying down. They are not doing that. A lot of the entries in the sexual harassment form that we sent out were like, colleagues of people, like boys and men who made entries to report sexual harassment that was being done to their female colleagues. So I think we need like little more keen, serious top people. And like we say in the book, it is the ones who have the power positions, be it man or woman, who have the privileges. It will take them to break the rules for the change to come. I mean, and breaking the rules doesn't mean to do something illegal, but just to kind of challenge institutions, challenge the departments openly. So there is hope, but the trends are doesn't look good yet, because I think we need some kind of breakthrough.
So Nandita, I'll have you give you the last word in terms of where you see both the challenge and the hope.
I think what gives me the most hope is, it's kind of similar to what Aashima said, but just, having seen what is happening on ground, having seen these pockets of rebellions and these spirited struggles, and often from the lowest rungs of the scientific ladder, we see so much of hope. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of them are silenced because there is this notion that people who protest are being negative. But of course, if you think about it, the people who protest and the people who are fighting for something are the positive ones, because they are the ones who feel that some change is possible, whereas the others are, just defeatist. So when we see that these kind of things are happening despite the odds stacked against them, it gives us hope, but then it also quickly makes me really afraid for them because they're not being matched. They're not being supported by the top in a substantial ways. I didn't really want to be bleak, but I think the hope is in the people, but I'm waiting to receive some sort of hope also from the people with power.
So you don't think the Vigyan proposal to give a Vigyan Ratna is instead of the many other awards that are out there, is a sign of hope? Or
now you're just baiting me, Sandip. Yeah, that's a terrible idea. I don't know what I'm missing and what their thinking is. Sometimes I just feel like these are just afterthoughts. The idea was that we'll scrap 100 plus science awards and replace that with Bharat Ratna, like Vigyan Ratna single award. And I think their argument is that so then we will only award the most excellent of the excellence. And in what world is that going to help diversity? I don't know who's fooling whom, but the scary part is I don't think they care. I don't think anyone at CSIR really cares about gender diversity. So yeah, Vigyan Ratna is not going to help.
Well, I hope at least lab hopping will help in some ways. So
yes.
Thank you very much for joining us, Nandita, Jayaraj and Aashima Dogra.
Thanks a lot, Sandip. It was a pleasure.
Thanks.
Nandita Jayaraj and Aashima Dogra co-authored the new book, Lab Hopping, Women Scientists in India. They are the duo behind the popular website, The Life of Science. Send us your thoughts about this show wherever you get your podcasts from. Find us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at Express Podcasts. Thanks as always for listening. This show was produced by Shashank Bhargava and edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. This is Sandip Roy on Express Audio.